going with 3.3. Also on the note of so 3.3, all this stuff really won't be on the test tomorrow. So you have that. It will, however, tie into stuff we do later in Unit 2. Okay, so that's kind of what you need to understand is this stuff is not going to directly tie into the test, but it's going to tie into stuff we do in the future. So I'm going to talk about what are the Android support libraries. We've kind of used them already, but we really haven't talked about what they are. We'll talk about some of the features that they provide. We'll talk about a few of those libraries. We'll talk also about how you set them up. But we also in this process need to talk a little bit about changes that have happened recently. So with, I think last spring or so, there's been kind of a major change to how these support libraries are arranged. So it's actually changed pretty majorly since this kind of book was written, if that makes sense, because it's changed in the last year. And one of the big things that's changed, remember anytime you create the project, there's that Androidx checkbox? That is brand new. That wasn't there last spring, as in spring 2019. That was not there. So it's something that they've actually moved all of the support libraries from where they used to be to this Androidx, which is part of something called Jetpack. Okay, so in the support libraries, there's a lot of different smaller pieces. There's more than 25 kind of libraries that you can bring in. And you kind of pick and choose what you need for your specific app. Usually you're going to find you have at least 3 of these support libraries that we need. The main one, which we're going to talk about, is AppCompat. We also have one for constraint layout. So anytime we want to bring in constraint layout, that's actually a separate support library. Or if we want to use recycler view, which we'll talk about in Unit 2, that's also going to be another support library. So we'll have a lot of these that we're bringing in. The whole point of these support libraries is to bring in either compatibility sort of classes so that your code can work with older versions of Android or newer versions of Android without making major changes, because there's a lot of things that have tweaked, that have changed over the years with the actual API. So it kind of covers over some of those details so you don't have to worry about them. The other thing that happens in there is there are new controls that have been added, including the constraint layout, which are actually not included as part of the normal standard Android library. And that's actually intentional. That's intentional so that they can update them on a more frequent basis and not be tied to a specific version of Android. Does that make sense? So they've actually broken a number of these things out. And the big thing here I want to mention, so we'll look at some of the stuff here. It talks about the version 4 library. If you're reading through the kind of concept chapter, and we'll talk about the version 4 library, we'll talk about the version 7 library, talk about, I think there's a version 11 library. What's happened is there grew to be so many different versions of the library, and it kind of hard to maintain. So Android's moved a lot of things over to this Androidx package. So backwards compatibility is a big part of what we'll see here, a big part of what is in the support library, and that's the big one that we bring in all the time, is the backwards compatibility functions. And there's also additional controls, again, like constraint layout and recycler view that have been added. There's also a card view, which you kind of think about how the bootstrap cards work. It's a similar sort of concept. There's also support in there for TVs and wearables, additional things that you may need to add if you're supporting those, right? Not the big thing we'll be focusing on this semester, but should you need to support TVs or watches, smartwatches, etc., those are support libraries you would need to bring in as well. There's also things in there for material design. Again, something we'll talk about more in Unit 2. There's some important components to kind of make that work. Did any of you remember going through and making an app with the basic activity template. You remember that? So you have the floating action button in the bottom right, you have kind of overflow in the top right. A lot of that falls into some of the newer features that fill into material design, and a lot of those depend on a specific support library to use those. So backwards compatibility. So the general recommendation is that we want to use the compatibility version anytime we can instead of the actual class. So anytime we create a new activity, you'll remember that it doesn't create it as a subclass of activity, right? When we create a new screen, we create a new activity. It's not created as made an activity extends activity. What class does it actually extend? You remember? Can you look it up? Huh? Nope. Look at it again. If you look at the actual code, so activities have to extend activity, but if we look at code that's actually generated, let's look at main activity. You see that? AppCompat activity. AppCompat activity is actually a subclass of activity. Okay. So the point of that is to provide some sort of backwards compatibility going back to version 9 of Android, actually. It gives us support going all the way back to version 9. So there's a lot of things that have changed. One of the things that's changed is the action bar has seen a lot of different things happen to it. It used to be back in version 9 you could do barely anything with it. But now we can set the name, we can add that up arrow. That up arrow is a relatively new thing, as well as we can add additional buttons into that action bar up the top, including the overflow menu. So all of those things are new, relatively speaking, and that allows us to use some of those features on older versions of Android. That make sense? So that's a big key to make all of this stuff work on older versions of Android, is it has to extend that. Otherwise, most things don't work. And the big thing that this then lets us do is, if you don't use this, then potentially you're in a point where you can get to a point where you have to create different versions of the same app for different versions of Android, right? We want to just be able to build it once and ship it out to as many devices as we can. So that helps us with this. And the way that works is it picks, depending on which SDK you're running, it'll pick which version of the code to use, right? So it may be changing what method it calls. It may be, with the newer Androidx, it may actually be changing what base class, what the class hierarchy is with AppCompat activity. So all these libraries, as I kind of mentioned a minute ago, they give us support back to API 9 or higher. Anything before 9, we forget it exists. It's old enough at this point that there are no devices that old. In fact, there's very few devices, as I said previously, that are below 21, 21 or 15. So the general recommendation nowadays is to use those Androidx libraries. Again, a year ago, the recommendation was to use a mix of the version 4 libraries and the version 7 libraries. But Androidx has made that a little bit simpler to deal with. So let's look at some of the libraries. Okay, and I'm going to go over these, kind of talking about it from the older side first. So version 4, which was the original version of the support libraries that came out, or the oldest one we really talk about, supported, you kind of can think about it as usually the version, as they say, is what's the minimum version it targets, even though nowadays they only support 9 or higher. So originally this targeted 8 or higher. Okay, it's got the largest set of backward compatibility things, again, because a lot of things changed in those early versions of Android. There's a lot of components There's a lot of different features in there. There's a lot of things to deal with network connectivity and a lot of utilities that you'll see. Now, with every version that came after version 4, it includes everything that came before, right? So if we look at the version 7 version of the library, it includes another version of everything that was in version 4. If we look at, I think, again, V11 includes everything from 7 and 4, etc. So the Androidx package, which we are now, is going to still include all this, but the namespace, the package name is different. The class names are all the same, but the package names have changed, is what's changed with Androidx. So, for example, some of the ones that are built into version 4, we've got the compat package, which got a lot of compatibility sort of wrappers, whether it be from colors to activities. A lot of the classes that we use all the time, it provides wrappers for. There's also some things under core utilities that you may be interested in, core UI, media compat if you're working with audio or video, and then there's also fragments in there because fragments are kind of a relatively new thing. They're sort of behave like partial views, but they didn't exist in those early versions of Android. So there's some work that needed to be done to make that work in older versions. The version 7, as I said, kind of takes that, adds some more things to it. So you get everything as far as backwards compatibility goes that was in version 4. There's also some TV specific thing that was added in version 7 of the library. There's some UI components. If I remember right, I think that I have to go back and look, but I think the constraint layout might have been added even the constraint layout and recycler may have been added going all the way back to there. There's also the Google Cast support. So if you want to, say, push a video or some audio to a Chromecast device, you may need to bring in that support library to use that. Okay, again, that will have now moved. It still exists, but it's over in Androidx instead of being in version 7. There's also some things with the color palette and preferences that exist in there. So the names of those packages and the names have actually carried over to Androidx. So we've got the AppCompat. That's the one you'll see anytime you create a new project. This one is already included because AppCompat is kind of a critical one. That's where our AppCompat activity comes from. Card view, it's also another new one, and that will let you, like I was saying, kind of make bootstrap cards. So you may be interested in that as we get into showing lists of things. There's a grid layout. This grid layout is really what it is underneath the surface is actually just a bunch of linear layouts put together. So you have a linear layout going vertically and then linear layouts going horizontally. So it does work for those kind of things if you really do have a grid. It may be a better choice sometimes than trying to do that with a constraint layout. However, it does have a big performance overhead, so you kind of have to weigh the options and maybe not use it if you're using a lot of cells, right? So something that's relatively small, maybe it's a 4x4 or 5x5, something like that's probably going to be okay as a grid layout. But if it's something else, you may want to take that route. Media router is another package we can bring in. And then that's going to deal with AV streams, palette for taking colors out of images. If the user is like giving us an image and they kind of want an eyedropper, there's some features in there. Recycler view, again, we'll talk about that, is really a very nice, useful control for showing long lists of things efficiently. So when we deal with databases, that's going to be really important, and web services is going to be really important to use that recycler view. And then there's also a library for working with preferences. So saying the user wants to keep something long term, not have it be lost if they shut down the app and restart it, Preference has some tools for that. So if we want to bring in the AppCompat library, which includes, for instance, the action bar, support for working with older action bars and the newer action bar, or you remember we did sharing back when we were talking about implicit actions. Well, that also runs through this AppCompat. So that's included in there. The way that you used to include it, you see, was COM, Android support, AppCompat, and then you have this -v7 because this is the version 7 library, or it might say version 4 if you're working with version 4, and then 27.1.1, right? So 27 says that we're kind of targeting API 27, and then 1.1 is the version kind of that support number. So what's changed is instead of bringing this in, we bring it as Android.appcompat::appcompat, right? So this is what you're going to see in your Gradle nowadays, and not this. Does that make sense? What's changed is what we see in our Gradle file. And you'll also see that the way we do our version numbers, we're now dealing with version 1.1.0 instead of a big version number like that that's kind of tied to our target version. Does that make sense? If our target is 27, that needs to be 27. If our target was 26, well, that would have to be 26. So it makes it easier to manage our Gradle files additionally and to update packages. So there's a lot of different support libraries that exist over there. It's worth kind of perusing the documentation to see everything that's there. There's a lot more than we can touch here in this one lesson. If you follow through this link here, support libraries feature documentation, you're going to get to this page. Okay. Now this used to be the standard place to start to get to all of the documentation about the support library. But if you look at the very top of the page, you'll kind of see what's happened. So with the release of Android 9.0, again, this happened about last year, there's a new version of the support library called Androidx, part of Jetpack. And the Androidx library contains all of the existing support libraries and also the latest Jetpack components. So it's everything that came before plus the new stuff. So the thing that you need to understand, here is the second part. So you can continue using the support library. It says they'll still be kind of maintained if you have an existing package. They're still going to be available, but they recommend moving over to the Androidx for all the new packages, which is why that's the only option they give you when you create a new project, right? Androidx or not. And the recommendation then is also as well to migrate anything that if you have an existing app, to migrate it to there. Because what they've officially said is they will not be making any new versions of the support libraries. That's kind of end of life at this point. So there will be no more versions of the Android support libraries. They're all going to be under Androidx now. Does that make sense? So this is documentation to look through. It still is relevant because a lot of things are basically moved over to Androidx and kept the same name and the same functionality. But note that a lot of things are in flux. A lot of your package names will have changed because of that. If you want to get an overview of Androidx, you can actually just click in here, and that will take you to a page that will talk about, hey, what is this new thing called Androidx? Where can you find things? Where has everything moved? So there's a whole page here. If you look at package refactoring, you'll talk about where do you need to move things. So class mappings, zoom out a second here. So for instance, if I want to look at everything that's in the version 7 library, you can see that it used to be, those classes used to be, for instance, the action bar was Android support v7 app action bar, but now it's Androidx AppCompat app action bar. So what's changed is what namespace they're in, but the class basically functions the same way. That makes sense? It also means as you're using some of these classes, you have to be very careful when you say, do you want to import this package or that package? Well, make sure that you're pulling the version from the Androidx support library and not the older v7, v4 libraries. Does that make sense? Otherwise, you're going to have some issues. So how do we use these support libraries? The fact of the matter is we kind of already used them with the stuff we've done, but we do want to walk over a little bit about maybe what's happening behind the scenes. So it used to be your first step that you had to do is you had to go into the SDK manager and actually download these. So you had to download them through the IDE. So you would say, okay, well, I want to use constraint layout. There's some stuff, additional stuff you have to download in SDK manager. That's all gone away. Okay, so it actually is downloaded now on a project per project basis. Does that make sense? So rather than you saying, hey, I want to use constraint layout, so I need to download the constraint layout tools. I can skip that step. I just need to add stuff in my Gradle. Okay, so where it used to be, older versions of Android Studio, we went into the SDK manager, like we've seen before, and it used to be, if I went to SDK tools, you would have seen this section, support repository, and seen a bunch of checkboxes where you say, hey, I want support line repository, I want constraint layout, I want et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You had to also install all of those pieces. That whole section is gone. So the version of Android Studio that we're working with does not have that support library grouping at all. It's gone. That makes sense? So it won't be there anymore. So let's say we want to bring something here. We're going to go through the documentation and say, hey, I want this package. That package is probably, it should give you some sort of information for, hey, here's the thing you need to include in your Gradle file. So we'll look at that. We may, for instance, let's say we're looking at the AppCompat Library. We'll kind of go through there. It may say add something like this, right? So COM, Android support, AppCompat, version 7.26, right? Obviously, you need to change those version numbers depending on what you're doing, but nowadays, this is what you're looking for. So does that make sense? So what's in the documentation may still show, is still going to show that. What you actually need to put in your Gradle is this. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up that Build Gradle app. We're going to look for the dependency section and put that in there. So if I go, say, open up one of the projects that we've already looked at, I'm going to go under the Gradle script section, go to, again, module app. This is not going to, you won't find this under the project section, it'll be the module app section. So if we go to the bottom of the file, of the module Gradle app file, what you'll see is this dependencies section. So dependencies is anything that's not part of the normal Android SDK that I want to bring in and I want to use, or not part of the standard Java SDK. So what we can see here, actually the first thing we see here is anything that I'm using locally. So here it says implementation file tree. You can kind of see dir libs. So it'll actually look first in your libs folder and say, hey, is there any jar files you want to use? Now that's for historically a lot of older things that maybe weren't shipped as part of Maven dependencies is what we'll see below. These are all based on Maven. That was just, hey, here's a jar file, use it in your application. And you can still do that. You can take any set of Java code, you kind of build it, and then put those class files into a jar file. A jar file is actually just a renamed zip file. You can literally throw it into a zip file, change that extension from zip to jar, and you've got a jar. But there's another tool that you use usually to make a jar file. But that's really all you have to know. All you really need to know about a jar file. It's a zip file with a different extension. So that's for older dependencies that you may find that are just standard. They work with any version of Java. Next thing we'll see is, say, implementation. So implementation, that means, hey, I'm going to use this for my main source set. Okay, so anything that's under implementation is going to get used with that main source set. It's not necessarily intended for our, we were not necessarily going to use it with our unit tests. Does that make sense? So I have AppCompat. Again, that's going to give me my AppCompat activity and similar. I've got the constraint layout because I'm going to use that. Both of these things will be included immediately when you create a new project. All of that stuff here is automatically just added to any new package you add as long as you check that Androidx box. So if we also wanted to bring in another library, let's say we wanted to bring in recycler view, then you'd also see another one down here for recycler view. If you want to bring in card layout or card view, you'd see another one for card view, etc., etc. Does that make sense? Okay. Then we also see lines that start with test implementation. Those are the ones that we're using for our local unit tests. So you remember what we did on Friday, we were working with JUnit and we were doing just straight Java tests. So there we're saying, hey, here's the version of JUnit I want to use to run those local tests. You also see some additional classes here, some additional packages, or sorry, dependencies, but they all start with Android test implementation. So those are the tests that are actually going to run on the Android device or emulator. Just instrumented test, which we'll talk about later. So we're saying what are the packages that go there. And the other thing that you'll see here, these have also switched. So there used to be a support library for testing. That's also now moved over to Androidx.test. So does that make sense? Yeah.
You added a library, you just add things, or would you do it?
So I would just change this file. If I needed another library, I would put it in here. Let's say I wanted to recycle view, I would just add it in here, and I hit sync. Okay. That's really all you have to do. Now, that being said, if I go to my layout designer, and let's say I'm going to add another screen real quick just for testing purposes. So activity, and create a new activity because I don't want to change the original. And create another empty activity, and I'm going to call this the user list activity because I'm still in that login screen. So what I wanted to get to is I've got a blank layout here. And if I want to say use recycler view, you'll see it's already here. See? It's already in the list of things I can drag and drop. But note I haven't included it in my dependencies yet. Right? I haven't. So notice that there's a little download icon right here. Right? So the download icon is actually telling me I need a dependency for that control that I haven't included yet. And actually they've made it really simple. If I drag the recycler view in, see what it says? This operation requires the library Androidx recycler view, which we haven't included yet. It's already figured that out. So if I say, would you like to add it now? Okay. It will go ahead and add it in and also do the job of adding it as a dependency. So if I look at here, you'll see that recycler view now shows up. So most of the time, as long as you're using, most of the time you can just start using it, and Android Studio will automatically add the dependency for you. The place that you'll need to go check that is first of all, if you get into a situation where it didn't do that, or if you need to update these versions, which does happen, right? So let's say I had built this. Let me move this up. Let's say I had built this previously, and maybe I was running with version 1.0. So I'm going to change that to 1.0. I'm going to hit sync. So right now I'm running on version 1.0 of the recycler view. You'll see it's kind of highlighted. It says, hey, there's a newer version, right? So that's all you need to do to know that there's a newer version. You go into the Gradle file and it'll highlight and tell you which ones are out of date. It'll actually also tell you which one's the newer version. So if I want to get back to the newer version, I just change that to 1.0 and hit sync now. Does that make sense? So for the most part, the only reason that you'll need to get in here is if you need to update those packages, which may be the case if you're using, say, some of the starter applications that come with this book. You need to bring them into the new Androidx, because all the starter applications or the example apps that they have are still using the older version 4, version 7 versions of the library. That makes sense? But for the most part, it will do it automatically if you drag things in, or if you're doing import in the middle of your Java code, it'll automatically bring those things in for you. So that's really all there is to that. It's basically just a matter of bringing them in your dependencies and then using them. Your code lab for 3.3 will kind of run through a few things there. For instance, looking at some of those compat classes that are there. Like color compat is one of the ones that it asks in the homework about. So you'll kind of dig into what those are. But it's pretty simple overall. It's basically just trying to make it so that you don't have to know the differences in all these versions of Android. And things just kind of work. Questions? So I'll set you loose to start on the code labs.